I am Lucas, and welcome to Abstract Essay, where ideas take shape, thoughts find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He has written movies and TV shows like HBO's Iconic, and no other than Mr. Alan Katz. And of course, a podcast host too. Mr. Alan, welcome to Abstract Essay. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me here on Abstract Essay. It is a pleasure to be here. As you said, I wrote and produced movies and TV shows like HBO's Iconic, Tales from the Crypt. In fact, I co-created the Crypt Keeper, that character. Uh, many TV shows. My story, I would say, is a story. I went from being a really good writer into being a storyteller. And in order to get there, I had to hit bottom. And Tales from the Crypt was incredible success. What came after, strangely, was profound failure. I touched the stars, and then I fell back to earth, and it was painful. Um, it turned out that there was something inside me that was holding me back. Uh, I went through a 2 decade long depression and a writer's block I didn't even know I was in. I came within literal inches of killing myself. And when I finally reached out and got help, uh, and mm, I knew I needed to be medicated, my father was a surgeon. I grew up in the medical culture. And I knew that my GP had limited knowledge about mood stabilizers. The last pharmaceutical rep that walked through his office, hey, you got any depressed patients? Try this on them. I, you're already a lab experiment because so little is known about how these medications work, though they can work. So I didn't want to be a lab experiment where no one had checked off any of the boxes. So I had done my research and I drove to my GP. I said, here's what I want to do. Here's what I've researched. He looked it up on his smartphone, said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. He wrote the prescription. I picked it up, went home, told my family what I was going to do. I took the first dose, and then I got incredibly lucky. And I leveled within 36 hours. I felt the darkness. It wasn't put into a box. It was in a cage. I could still see it. It could still see me. It could reach out through the bars and try to get at me. But because my darkness, the self-loathing rage that had taken me to that place was no longer able to get me, I could address the fact that I've been keeping a secret from myself for 45 years. That when I was 14, I was sexually molested twice by the religious director at the synagogue where my family belonged outside of Baltimore. It wasn't, the first time is bad, but for me, it's the second time that was the problem. The second time happened because I didn't say anything the first time.
Mhm.
Well, in the moment, I blamed me. And it was my fault inside my own head that an adult was doing this to a child. But that becomes the template, and I'm not unique in that happening to me. Uh, as I headed into adulthood, and that became my behavior pattern whenever things went wrong, just to take the blame for it. That doesn't solve the problem, it doesn't solve anybody's problem. But that became part of how I solved problems. Um, when I finally was able to confess this secret to myself, an amazing thing happened. It's true what they say about the truth setting you free. And finally, I could. What what happened to me when I was 14, when I suddenly was keeping this secret, it separated me from me. And to suddenly be back in touch with me, and more importantly, to be able to tell myself my own story. If you can't tell your own story to yourself, can you really tell anyone else's story? I'd say no. And so as I suddenly became able to tell my story to myself, I evolved from being a writer, a good writer, into a storyteller. And there's a difference. And that suddenly became my purpose. Uh, During the pandemic, a Tales from the Crypt fan group had started a they started a podcast called Dads from the Crypt. They reviewed all the episodes of Tales from the Crypt, and their three dads. They gave parenting advice, and one of them reached out to me and said, "Hey, you want to? We're going to be reviewing one of the episodes you wrote. You want to be on the podcast and sit in with us?" I said, "Yeah, that sounds like fun." So I did, and it was fun. I listened to. I talked about the making of the episode. I gave parenting advice. A few weeks later, Jason reached out to me again, and he said, "Hey, we're going to be reviewing the second Crypt feature, Bordello of Blood. Do you want to sit in again?" Well, making Tales from the Crypt was, and anyone who made that show would tell you, one of the greatest creative experiences of our lives because of the incredible freedom that we had. I oversaw, the writer and producer, I oversaw 70 some odd episodes. Over the course of those years and episodes, I got 3 notes from HBO. 3 notes. And none of them was mandatory. They were, we'd like it if you did this instead. That's how much freedom we had working at HBO, and the entire creative team had that freedom. It was a remarkable experience. We ended up turning the franchise around, and it ended up Universal ended up wanting several feature films, and we made, I think, a very good feature film with the first Crypt feature film, Demon Knight. I think turned out quite well. The second Crypt feature, everything went completely wrong. We ended up making this thing called Bordello of Blood, which, from the audience's perspective, is just a mediocre horror movie. But from inside, it's like everyone took their eye off the ball. And from the studio down, everyone, everything you could possibly do wrong in a creative process or project, any kind of project, we did it wrong. It was it was almost antithetical to the creative process of making that movie. In the end, uh, it I had been creative partners with a guy named Gil Adler for a decade. By the time the movie was released, we were no longer speaking to each other. We were no longer friends or creative partners, and we didn't speak for 25 years. My descent into madness really began with the making of Bordello of Blood. So when Jason said to me, "Hey, you want to sit in? We're going to be reviewing Bordello of Blood. You want to sit in again?" I said, "Jason, the story of the making of Bordello of Blood is not a half-hour conversation with you. It's a podcast unto itself." And that was the impetus for my first podcast, the How Not to Make a Movie podcast. The first season was subtitled "The Making of Bordello of Blood." And in terms of, it's how to do everything wrong. Uh, that was that story. But I found in telling the story of the making of Bordello of Blood, and it was important to tell the story with absolute absolute honesty. It was essential to me. Yeah, there were only a couple of people I wanted to call out. One was Dennis Miller, who starred in the movie because we paid him $1 million, which is $1 million more than anyone ever paid him in a movie. Could afford to be a little nicer. The other person was Sylvester Stallone. Sylvester Stallone was engaged to a supermodel named Angie Everhart, and Sylvester Stallone insisted that Angie Everhart be the villain of our movie, even though it was not the part for Angie. It was not a good role for her, and he had an ulterior motive. He really wanted to break up with her and use our movie as the collateral. Hey, I got your movie, didn't I? Yeah, and he made us his co-conspirators in betraying a very nice person. So I needed to call him out for that. And the other person I needed to call out in the podcast was me. What what my past had done to me in disconnecting me from me. I had no confidence. I had confidence in me as a writer, but I had no confidence in me as a person. And that ultimately undermined all my success and everything. It wasn't until I suddenly reconnected with me and reconnected with my own story that I could tell other people's stories too. And in in order to tell the Bordello story, I had to get back in touch with Gil because I need to tell the story honestly. Gil's half of that story. So we talked for the first time in 25 years, and I said, look, here's what I want to do. I want to tell the story of Bordello of Blood, and I want to tell the story of our breakup and all the things that happened and were said and were done and in the intervening years. And I don't want to talk about it beforehand. I want to do this all live on mic. And he was rather fearful about it, not without reason, but he agreed, which was very courageous of him. And like I said, the goal was to tell the story with absolute honesty. When we put it out, that first season of the How Not to Make a Movie podcast, Entertainment Weekly called it the best film podcast of 2022. And Clark Collis, the writer who said those very kind words, he told me why he wrote that. After he listened to the podcast, he was taken aback by the honesty. It was, yeah, very honest. And he wanted to know that this wasn't an act, that it was real. And so when he interviewed Gil and me, he saw, no, that was the intention, to tell this story with absolute honesty. And I found in telling it via a podcast that I really loved the podcasting medium as a storytelling medium, in large part because you could tell a story with such complete and total honesty. I had a friend from school reached out to me. He had a story he wanted to something that happened to him in his life, true story about his life, that he wanted to turn into a TV series. Now, under any certain under just regular circumstances, to take an idea, okay, from my head, turn it into a TV series. Well, the script doesn't write itself overnight. That's years, literally years, to write a script that's ready for the marketplace. The average is 10. Let's say you're really good, you get it done at 3. Okay, I got the three. You've already spent 3 years on this idea, 3 years developing this thing. All right, it's ready for marketplace. Well, you wrote the first episode. What happens in episode 2, 3, and 4, and the rest of the first season? What happens in episode season 2 and in season 3 and 4? Hey, who are all these characters? Explain them. You got to write, in addition to the script, it's called a Bible. And that's 50, 60, 70 pages of incredible detail. Well, that doesn't write itself overnight. Figure another year. All right, now you're 4 years into it, and no one's read it yet. Okay, now you're ready for the marketplace. You want to take it to one of a handful of executives. There are not a whole lot of places you're going to take this to be looked at. To induce those executives to read, you have to create a pitch deck, which is a comic book version, PowerPoint presentation, sparse words, lots of images. Here's what it's about, just to get them some into the zone of they kind of know what it's about. That's just to induce them to read. To read. All right, let's say they say, yeah, okay, I'll read this. I'll see where it goes. Well, that doesn't get you too far. You haven't they haven't bought it yet. Now they're going to read it, and you got to convey the IP to them, the intellectual property, and between there and getting it done, oh my God, there are thousands of assholes standing in your way through the development process, the production process, and at any point, any one of those assholes can kill your project dead just because they're an asshole. Fact of life. Years, and really still nobody's read it. Now, to take the same idea, turn it into a podcast, there's only one asshole standing in my way, and it's me. So long as I'm willing to do the work, I got to find the audience, help the audience find it. I'll take that challenge. Uh, for pretty much any kind of story I can think of, this is a very appealing way to do it, to own it all and to get to tell it exactly the way you want to. Well, my friend's story was very problematic because it's tricky material. I talked him out of turning it into a, a TV series at first. I said to him, we can revisit this later. But he agreed to do it as a podcast. And that became my first narrative story podcast, The Donor, a DNA horror story. And that's about my friend Hal. It's absolutely true story. Uh, in the mid 1990s, Hal worked his way through medical school as an anonymous sperm donor. Jump forward 27 years. Hal was a successful radiologist. He joined 23andMe, curious about his health genes. It never occurred to him the ramifications of adding his DNA to a growing DNA database. That's what 23andMe is, and Ancestry. He lost his donor anonymity. Suddenly, 7 total strangers found Daddy, except 6 of them had no idea their actual biological father was Hal, a sperm donor. The 7th, one of the daughters brought a thing called genetic sexual attraction to the table. Now, genetic sexual attraction, apparently there is data and research that suggests that people who are genetically related to each other, siblings, for instance, but who are not raised together, when they meet each other in adulthood, it is not unusual for there to be sparks. They bump into someone who they feel like they've known their whole life. This person completes their sentences. They laugh at the same things. If there's any kind of spark, a romantic spark, as with the woman who coined the term genetic sexual attraction, her name is Barbara Gagne. She gave up a son for adoption when she was 16. She met him 25 years later. He was 25, and she fell head over heels in love with him. She was not his mother. She did not mother him, but because she was disconnected from the instant of birth, really something in the genetics just set off a spark. Now, though she was interested in being sexual with him, he was not he was not able to do that with her. He was not quite there, but she coined the term. And as I said, the adoption community has bumped into this often. Well, when this one of the daughters brought this subject to the table, it was like a hand grenade tossed into the circus tent. The donor conceived siblings, they refer to each other as dibblings, have a very tight bond between them. They a much tighter bond because these are, hey, I got a half brother, I got a half sister, and these are easier bonds to have and form than with the donor, who is a total stranger in every way, shape, and form. Um, in Hal had been married to a woman for 20 years who had brought a son from a previous marriage, and he raised that son as his own, adopted him later as an adult, but he had never raised any biological children of his own. And he was enthralled with the idea that he had all these biological children. He was not going to father them. They had fathers, but he was open to being fatherly towards them. And he had money, and he was open to cutting them in on the inheritance because they were blood. But when this one of the donor conceived daughters, through genetic sexual attraction out there, it it just blew everything up. And the happy alternative family that Hal hoped he would end up with, it went all to hell. Well, I was enthralled with the thought of telling Hal's story. I had never heard a story even remotely like it, and I got a taste for weird stories. Yeah. Uh, when when Hal agreed, now Hal knew he couldn't use his name in telling this story, which would have made him a completely unreliable narrator. And so, as I explained to him, me telling your story, well, that works because I can protect your identity and everyone's identity that I need to. And rather than being an unreliable narrator, I become like the referee. I almost become more reliable for keeping everyone's secrets, whereas Hal narrating his own story would have the opposite effect. All right. As I was telling Hal's story, and really in a podcast, you have so much available to you. It's radio, it's theater of the mind. You have music, you have sound, so many devices to create to take the listener into the world in which your story is taking place. And I have a very I have a movie theater sensibility, so a cinematic sensibility, and that's what I bring to podcast storytelling. I want to bring wherever I possibly can. I want to bring the environment to life to place the listener inside of it with the storyteller. That's one of the wonderful things that podcasting can do. And as I was telling Hal's story, I realized I had become the thing I always wanted to be when I grew up, which is a podcaster. In in doing the background research to tell Hal's story, I had to look into the donor conceived community, and one of the members of the donor conceived community who very graciously agreed to talk to me, her name was Donna Hall. Donna learned when she was 40 that she was donor conceived, blew her mind. But when Donna told me the rest of her story, it's mind boggling. I said, Donna, you are a podcast unto yourself. And she said, I know, I've been trying to do it. But Donna's problem was even a great story needs to be told the right way in order to be a great story. And Donna had a little too close to the story to see how to tell it. But Donna had an amazing story, and that became my second narrative story podcast, The Hall Closet. Um, Donna grew up in the mid 90s outside of Philadelphia in a lower tier crime family. The Halls weren't the Corleones from the Godfather movies, but they made national headlines just the same. Donna's mom, Phyllis, may be the worst mom ever. Truly. She spent 6 months in prison for child endangerment. Donna's stepdad, John Hall, a true criminal mastermind. He put more than 25 people behind bars in Pennsylvania based on bullshit confessions he'd concocted to mitigate his own considerable legal peril. Among the people that John Hall put in jail was his own stepson, Herb, who spent 18 months awaiting trial for a murder that he did not commit. John Hall put a man named Walter Ogrod on death row in Pennsylvania for 24 years based on a bullshit confession, the murder that absolute Walter did not commit in no way, shape, or form. When Pennsylvania let Walter out, they paid him $9.1 million for their mistake. Donna tells this.
Mr. Alan,
Yes,
to wrap up our discussion for today, what are your short-term and long-term goals in podcasting?
what I've come to realize is that everyone has a story, and therefore everyone has a podcast. And my goal is to tell every single one of them.
Mr. Alan, thank you so much for being part on Abstract Essay. And can you please invite our listeners to support all your podcasts, your advocacy, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Absolutely, positively. They can find everything that we're doing at https://costardandtouchstone.com. That's my production company, Costard and Touchstone Productions, COSTARDAND Touchstone, TOUCHSTONE.com. Great podcasts, no fooling. We 5 podcasts out in the world right now, a dozen more on the way. We are on a mission to make the world a better place through storytelling. If you listen to our podcast, I think you'll find we're serious about that mission.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Alan Katz, because if you support him, as he said, more and more empowering podcasts to come. So, Mr. Alan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for having me on your podcast. Pleasure has been mine.
More to come, people. See you soon.